In order to talk about the structure of the CV system, I initially here want to introduce you just to one single red blood cell. And I'm not going to be very specific. In a second, we're just going to represent it as a little dot in a moment. But we know a bit more about these things, of course. They're sort of circular shape. They have a biconcave disc structure. They contain millions of hemoglobin. They have no nucleus. We have all of this knowledge about red blood cells. They're 7 micrometers wide and so on and so on. They fit perfectly down a capillary, and they're the exact width of a capillary. None of that matters for today's session. What we're going to talk about today is their journey through this system. So I want to introduce you, first of all, to what I'm going to describe to you as the right atrium. Now you might be thinking, hang on a minute, James, you've literally drawn a box there with a couple of holes in it. Yes, we have. And the reason we're going to do that is that leading into this box, and I'm only going to show you the inferior example, leading into this box, we have a vein, and that vein is going to include our charming little red blood cell. Here it is. I'm just going to imagine it's there, and it follows its path and it returns to the heart into this right atrium. Okay, so we've now got our red blood cell inside our right atrium of the heart. Remember the word atrium? Well, remember, be aware that the word atrium, it refers to kind of opening or entryway. The only thing I'd add to that at the moment is that the vein leading back to the heart, which they're always veins if they're leading back, is called our vena cava, or vena cava. I'm never totally sure how to pronounce that. We actually have two of these. There's an inferior lower body and a superior upper body. I'm going to represent them together here. But we've got these red blood cells returning back to the right atrium. What happens to them next? Well, those red blood cells will be forced down out of the right atrium, and they will be forced into what we refer to as the right ventricle. Here it is. So let's put this in here. The right ventricle. Okay, the right ventricle. This is our lower chamber of the heart, and our red blood cell is going to travel down. It's going to flow into the right ventricle, and of course what's going to happen here is we're going to have a bunch of blood in this right ventricle down here. Now, a couple of things before we go further. This valve I just kind of mentioned here, this is what we call our TCV. Okay, our TCV, and TCV refers to tricuspid. Let me try and write this correctly. Tricuspid valve. Okay, so just be aware of that tricuspid valve. The whole idea of that valve is that these red blood cells can only, and the rest of the blood, right? These could equally be white blood cells, fragments of cells like platelets, the plasma itself. They're flowing down into this area. Now, once they're down into this right ventricle, what's going to happen next? Well, interestingly, the right ventricle squeezes, we call it systole, and it squeezes the blood back up in this direction. Now you might be thinking, well, it goes back through this valve. No, actually, these red blood cells now, they start to travel back up like this. Now they go behind the right atrium and they emerge out of the top of the heart. Okay, so they emerge out of the top of the heart here. Okay, and they're going to loop off like this, and they're going to loop off like this, and they're going to loop off to the lungs. Okay, and at the lungs, they're going to be oxygenated with an increased supply of oxygen. Now, one thing I want to mention to you: this vessel here is called the pulmonary. Pulmo means lung, artery. Now, that is leading to the lungs. These red blood cells are now. So let me go back here. They're now traveling up to the lung this way. They're oxygenated at the lungs, and what we're going to find now is that these red blood cells are going to travel back. I'm just representing with red because it's useful here. They're going to travel back, and they're going to re-enter the... Oops, that's not the one I meant to click. They're going to re-enter the heart here. So these red blood cells are going to... A bit of a crazy drawing, but these red blood cells are now going to... And all the rest of the blood, of course, they're going to re-enter the heart here. Now, just to be clear, this here is our pulmonary vein. Okay, so they re-enter here into the left atrium. And if you're watching this and you think, well, James, why is it left on that side and why is it right on the side I showed you first? You need to imagine this positioned in your own chest. Okay, so you're looking at this almost mirror-like. All right, so just be aware of that. So this is as if it was sat in your chest. All right, that's why it's left and right on this side. But these red blood cells come in here, and what they're going to do is they're going to pass through the atrium, and they're going to pass down through another valve. Okay, and when they pass down through that valve, they're going to enter the left ventricle. Okay, so here's my left ventricle. Now notice that I've made the wall of this left ventricle thicker. I'll come back to that in a second. But our red blood cells are travelling down into the left ventricle like this. Now, this valve here is what we call your BCV. And that, by the way, is your bi, not tri-cuspid valve. Its job is to prevent backflow. Sorry, I should have said as well, guys. Actually, a bit of a mistake on my part here. We also have valves here. Here we have a valve here. This is called your SLV, or your semi-lunar valve. Let me write that in there for you. Your semi-lunar valve. Okay, that's going to get in my way in a second, but never mind. So what happens now? We've got our red blood cells now in our left ventricle. So our left ventricle is filled with blood, and that blood is going to be ejected upwards and outwards from the heart. Okay, so when this contracts systole, the red blood cells are forced up, it travels behind the left atrium, and it emerges, just imagine that those words weren't there, it emerges into a really big blood vessel which travels all the way down here, and it's going to travel, if I just bring this down slightly, it's going to travel all the way down to what we call the rest of the body. Okay, so I'm just going to sketch it, let me just get it all in shot. So it's ultimately going to travel down like this. I mean, it also goes up, by the way. And this is what we would describe as the body. Think about the tissues, all tissues of the body, where oxygenated blood needs to be delivered. So this red blood cell is now traveling through this aorta. Let's label that aorta. I should say the pulmonary vein is this one. This aorta is transporting oxygenated blood to the body, to places like the muscle cells, for example. And what's going to happen, of course, we complete our loop, because that depositing of blood takes place, and I think I've chosen the wrong blue, and then we have the return of our red blood cell to where we started over here, and that cycle is going to repeat. So there's a couple of things that I would mention to you that are really important, just to sort of stress this story and make sure that you understand it as fully and completely as possible. Thing number one is I just want to mention to you that the heart is muscular. Okay, so let's be clear, we talk about it as a pump, but this thickened left ventricular wall, for example, is a thick piece of cardiac muscle. Its job is to generate force to mobilize and move this blood. That's its job. So think about it. And you might want to think about why the left ventricle wall is bigger, because it's got to deliver blood to the entire body rather than, for example, the right ventricle that just delivers blood to the lungs, which is literally right next door to the heart. Okay, so less force required compared to the left ventricle. Secondly, I want to stress the role of valves. Okay, so just to show you again the 4 valves that we've got, we have got one here, tricuspid, one here, bicuspid. We have our semi-lunar valve here, and we'd also have one here, semi-lunar valve here. That's really important. All of them are to prevent backflow. Blood may only travel in one direction. If it doesn't, we are in big trouble, okay? So it prevents backflow in that way. That we sometimes call them one-way valves. It's a nice way to think about them. Thirdly, I want to stress to you the point about pressure. Okay, if you think about where blood's at highest pressure, it's going to be round about here. As blood leaves the left ventricle behind the left atrium up through the aorta, remember we can't see the aorta sort of leaving here, but it's kind of here behind the left atrium, okay? But pressure is highest here because this left ventricle is so forceful. Where's pressure lowest? Pressure is lowest maybe here or here. So you might want to be thinking about, well, how does blood still keep moving in return? That's for a different lesson, but it's an interesting question. And the last one, I don't really have, I will get it in here. Okay, we must be aware, and I think this is a really nice thing to think about, what comes in, let me just jump vena cava, must go out. So I want you to think about this principle. There is a direct relationship between the quantity of blood coming back and the quantity of blood ultimately leaving the heart. So therefore, the question we've got to sort of be thinking about is what comes in must go out. That doesn't mean that every blood cell, every piece of plasma leaves the heart each contraction. No. But what it does mean is that unless we get blood back into the heart, there's no blood to circulate and move. So that's a crucial point, and we'll study that in more detail at another time. Thanks.